California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
3 historical causes of the racial wealth gap. The modern racial wealth gap between African Americans and other racial groups began with enslavement, but scholars debate whether enslavement should be the basis for reparations given that today's wealth gap is the cumulative effects of racism over centuries. 80. This section describes historical causes of the racial wealth gap during and post-slavery, including racial terror, land theft, mass incarceration, and discrimination in government benefits, the labor market, and banking. Enslavement. Several scholars have estimated the slavery bill for reparations. 81. Most of these estimates require a calculation in today's dollars for unpaid wages, the purchase prices of the human property, or the land promised to the formerly enslaved. 82. These estimates are generated by multiplying earlier values by a compounding interest rate. 83. For example, Thomas Kramer's calculations for unpaid wages owed to enslaved people amounts to $19.4 trillion in today's $84. He arrives at this number by multiplying the prevailing average market wage by the number of hours worked for each 24-hour day by those enslaved over the interval of 1776 to 1865 and applies a 3% interest rate. 85. Merely doubling the interest rate to the more realistic 6% would increase the total estimate to $6.6 quadrillion in 2019. $86. Similar to Kramer's estimates is James Markety's bill, using the idea of income diverted from enslaved persons, arriving at a figure of $2.1 trillion as of 1983-87 using a 6% interest rate. The 2018 value amounts to $171 trillion. 88 other estimates are reached by calculating the value in today's dollars of the wealth held in enslaved people as property. For example, Judah P. Benjamin, a critical member of Jefferson Davis's Confederate cabinet, proclaimed the value of enslaved persons in 1860 to be $4 billion. Which compounds to $42.2 trillion by 2019 at a 6% interest rate. 89 other scholars argue that these large sums are underestimates because they do not account for the physical and emotional harms of enslavement, the coercive nature of the system, the denial of the ability to acquire property, or the deprivation of autonomy. 90. White homesteaders in El Monte. 1936. The federal government essentially gave land away for free to mostly white families through the Homestead Act, 1936. Courtesy of Library of Congress. Post-enslavement. The case for reparation extends beyond slavery to the near-century-long era of legal segregation, violence and terror, and the atrocities that continue today. Mass incarceration, police killings of unarmed African Americans, sustained credit, housing, employment discrimination, and the immense black-white wealth disparity. 91 scholars have divided post-slavery American history into 5 overlapping phases of federal government policies, which created the modern racial wealth gap. They involve white wealth creation through government land grants and mortgage subsidies, and black wealth destruction through racial terror, eminent domain, and mass incarceration. White wealth creation through government land grants. From 1862 to 1976, the federal government transferred massive amounts of land mostly to white families. Some scholars have named this phase the wagon train phase, after the covered wagon caravans romanticized by 1950s television shows, which carried white families to seek their fortunes in the West. 92. In 1862, the federal government established the Homestead Act, which distributed land until about 1980, although more occasionally after the 1920s. 93 The Homestead Act encouraged Western migration by providing American citizens, and immigrants soon to be citizens, up to 160 acres of public lands, which was increased to 320 acres in 1909, for $0 if they continuously lived on the property for 5 years and paid a small $10 filing fee. 94 Homesteaders also had the option of paying $1.25 per acre if they lived on the property for 6 months. 95 While the language of the act did not exclude people based on race, African Americans were unable to secure land allocations under the Act for 4 years until the Civil Rights Act of 1866 clarified that they were citizens. 96 California's homestead law similarly excluded African Americans before 1900 because they required a homesteader to be a white citizen. 97 Though black homesteaders were able to secure land allocations under the Act after 1866, they were few in comparison to the multitudes of white settlers and had to settle for the least desirable land. 98 Between 1868 and 1934, the federal government gave 246 million acres of land essentially for free to mostly white, native-born and immigrant Americans, an area close to the size of California and Texas combined. 99 More than 1.5 million white families received land patents, and today as many as 46 million of their living descendants reap the wealth benefits, approximately 1/4 of the adult population of the United States. 100 In comparison, and as an example, approximately 500 black claimants succeeded in obtaining their patents from the General Land Office in the Great Plains, granting them ownership of approximately 650,000 acres of prairie land. 101 The federal government undermined other efforts to allocate land to the formerly enslaved. Another estimate of reparations to African Americans can be made by calculating the value in today's dollars of the unfulfilled land distribution of 40 acres and a mule promised to the formerly enslaved. Beginning in 1865, 102 On January 16, 1865, upon seizing the coastline from Charleston, South Carolina to St. Johns River, Florida, 103 General Sherman issued Special Field Orders No. 15 that established the provision of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, designated for the settlement of the Negroes now made free by the Acts of War and the proclamation of the President of the United States. 104 The order carved out 400,000 acres of land confiscated or abandoned by Confederates. Each family of formerly enslaved black people would get up to 40 acres. 105 The Army would lend them mules no longer in use. 106 Further, the Freedmen's Bureau Act of March 3, 1865, had an explicit racial land redistribution provision that specified that not more than 40 acres of land was to be provided to refugee or freed male citizens at 3 years annual rent not exceeding 6% of the value of the land based on appraisal of the state tax authorities in 1860. 107 At the end of 3 years of occupying the land, they could purchase it and receive title. 108 Similar provisions were included in the post-war Southern Homestead Act of 1866. Freedmen were to receive land in the southern states at a price of $5 for 80 acres. 109 President Andrew Johnson intensely opposed these acts and neither were effectively implemented on behalf of the formerly enslaved. 110 By the end of 1865, Johnson also had ordered the removal of thousands of formerly enslaved persons from the lands they had settled under Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15, 111, which were ultimately given back to former enslavers. 112 With the exception of a small number who had legal land titles, freed black people were removed from the land as a result of President Johnson's Restoration Program. 113 If 4 million enslaved persons had gained emancipation by 1865, and the land allocation rule meant that roughly 40 acres would go to families of 4, each formerly enslaved individual would have been allocated about 10 acres. This implies a total distribution of at least 40 million acres of land. Between 1868 and 1934, the federal government gave 246 million acres of land essentially for free to mostly white Americans, an area close to the size of California and Texas combined. More than 1.5 million white families received land patents, and today as many as 46 million of their living descendants reap the wealth benefits, approximately 1/4 of the adult population of the United States. Using a conservative estimate of $10 per acre, the total value of the projected distribution of land to the freedmen would have been $400 million in 1865. 114. The value in today's dollars at a 6% interest rate would be $1.3 trillion. This number would be much higher if the conditions of the Southern Homestead Act, which provided for 80 acres of land to be sold to freedmen at $5 total, were treated as a debt to be paid to the descendants of the formerly enslaved. 115. If, as some scholars interpret, each freedman was eligible to receive 40 acres of land, it would have led to a much higher total value of the land to be distributed to freedmen after the war, amounting to $1.6 billion in 1865 and compounding to $12.6 trillion at a 6% interest rate in 2019. 116. Black wealth destruction through racial terror. From 1865 to the present, federal, state and local government actors refused to protect African Americans as they faced violence and land theft. Sometimes, government actors joined, led, or supported the violence. 117 is detailed in Chapter 3, Racial Terror. White federal, state, and local government officials, working jointly with private citizens, terrorized African Americans to prevent them from accumulating political and economic power. White mobs destroyed thriving black communities in racial massacres nationwide in Louisiana, North Carolina, Michigan, Delaware, Nebraska, Florida, Illinois, Oklahoma, Texas, and elsewhere. 118. The most well-known was the destruction of the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood District was known popularly as Black Wall Street. 119. Scholars estimate that the present value of destroyed black property in Tulsa is at least $100 million. 120. The 1919 massacre in Elaine, Arkansas destroyed $10 million of black wealth. 121. Evidence exists that murders of African Americans continue to be driven by underlying economic incentives. 122. Police killings of unarmed African Americans frequently occur in neighborhoods undergoing white gentrification. 123. White wealth creation through mortgage subsidies. In the 19th century, federal, state, and local governments passed laws and implemented practices that heavily subsidized the creation of the white middle class while substantively crippling the ability of black people to do the same. 124. Federal policies, implemented by private citizens, focused on helping mostly white Americans buy single-family homes. 125 is discussed in Chapter 5, The Root of Many Evils, Housing Segregation. The Veterans Administration, the Federal Housing Administration, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation helped white families buy single-family homes in the suburbs while preventing black families from doing the same. 126. Scholars estimate that the present value of destroyed black property in Tulsa is at least $100 million. General William Tecumseh Sherman's famous 40 acres and a mule field order, given in 1865, amounts to $1.3 trillion at 6% interest in today's dollars. Beginning in the 1930s and 1940s, the federal government created programs that subsidized low-cost loans and opened up home ownership to millions of average Americans for the first time. 127. At the same time, government underwriters introduced a national appraisal system, tying property value and loan eligibility in part to neighborhood racial composition. which designated predominantly non-white neighborhoods as hazardous and coloring these areas red, a process known as redlining 128. White communities received the highest ratings and benefited from low-cost, government-backed loans. Minority and mixed neighborhoods, and especially black neighborhoods, received the lowest ratings and were denied these loans. 129 This functionally concentrated African Americans into impoverished neighborhoods in America's urban centers. 130 of the $120 billion worth of new housing subsidized between 1934 and 1962, less than 2% went to non-white families, virtually locking them out of homeownership. 131. Today, approximately 3 in 4 neighborhoods (-74%) that the federal government deemed hazardous in the 1930s remain low to moderate income, and more than 60% are predominantly non-white. 132. Black wealth destruction through disenfranchisement and land theft. As described in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, the federal government passed the National Highway Act of 1956 and urban renewal legislation 133 funded by the federal government. State and local officials used eminent domain to destroy thriving black communities in the name of highway construction and urban renewal. Erasing generations of accumulated black wealth. 134 black business districts were cleaved by the highways and never recovered. 135. In the mid-20th century, the United States Department of Agriculture's USDA policies discriminated against and displaced black. 136 During the Civil Rights era, federal anti-discrimination statutes that applied to the USDA were diluted by the time they reached the local level, and did not provide protection for black farmers. 137 White USDA administrators gave millions of dollars in funding to all-white Southern local agricultural committees. 138 These powerful committees were county arms of the USDA and did not want black farmers on their boards, so they would prevent their election by splitting the black vote or through voter intimidation tactics. 139 These boards made decisions on loan recipients, acreage allotments, appropriate crop yields, hardship adjustments, and preferred farming methods benefiting white farmers. 140. The Farmers' Home Administration was another agency that discriminated against and displaced black farmers. 141 The agency offered loans and credit to poor farmers for home construction and improvement. 142 But instead of going to badly needed rural housing in the South, these loans went to segregated swimming pools, picnic areas, tennis courts, and golf courses in white communities. 143 Loan requirements were stringent and often subjective, such as whether an applicant was a good citizen. 144 Loans went to the white and wealthy while black farmers were turned down. 145 Even if a black farmer received a loan, agency administrators would seek to get rid of them by luring them into debt and then foreclosing and auctioning off their machinery. 146. As a result, black farmers were pushed off their land. 147 Lawrence Lucas, President Emeritus of the United States Department of Agriculture Coalition of Minority Employees, testified that the USDA's programs continue to discriminate against black farmers and that a culture of systemic racism at the USDA that denies black farmers their dignity, that denies black farmers a right to farm, denies black farmers the right to the same programs and services that white farmers get in this country, is still present today. 148. Funded by the federal government, state and local officials used eminent domain to destroy countless thriving black communities in the name of highway and park construction and urban renewal, erasing generations of accumulated black wealth. African American business districts were cleaved and never recovered. In 1910, black farmers owned 16 million acres of land. In 2007, they owned 32 million acres, an 80% loss. 149 In 1999, Black farmers filed a class action lawsuit against the USDA for unlawful discrimination against them in denying their farm loan applications. 150 The lawsuit, Pickford v. Glickman, ultimately settled for money damages, but no policy changes at the USDA. 151 While many claims have been paid, the USDA nonetheless has been slow to pay out all the claims, and has spent extensive resources in fighting claims. 152 In the 2021 coronavirus relief bill, $4 billion was set aside for debt relief for socially disadvantaged farmers, including Black farmers, but payments have been stopped due to an ongoing lawsuit alleging it is reverse racism and a windfall for some farmers. 153 Black wealth destruction through mass incarceration. In the late 1980s, mass incarceration and the war on drugs continued the American government's historical criminalization of African Americans. 154 As discussed in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System, African Americans have experienced marginalization, physical harm, and death at the hands of the American criminal justice system at both the federal and state level, beginning in slavery and continuing today. 155 During the slavery era, federal and state governments criminalized African Americans as a method of establishing, maintaining, and socially controlling African Americans as a lower class of human being than white Americans. 156 Today, mass incarceration continued to separate families and dehumanize the descendants of enslaved black people. 157 In the 156 years since slavery was abolished, Black people in the United States have gone from being considered less than human under the law to being treated as less than human by a criminal justice system that punishes them more harshly than white people. 158 Until the 1940s, state laws and the U.S. Constitution allowed private entities to force African Americans into doing the same work, on the same land, and even for the same people as during slavery, in a system called convict leasing. 159 People who were leased were treated even more brutally than enslaved people because plantation owners had a financial incentive to keep enslaved people alive. 160 Working and living conditions for incarcerated people were dangerous, unhealthy, and violent. 161 Most incarcerated people who were leased for labor did not survive to complete 10-year sentences. 162 Until the mid-1950s, states routinely forced chain gangs of imprisoned people to do public works projects while wearing chains weighing as much as 20 pounds. 163 American politicians ran on law and order, or tough on crime, platforms and passed laws and policies that punished African Americans more than white Americans, often for similar crimes. 164 This has contributed to mass incarceration and overrepresentation of African Americans in the criminal justice system to present day. Nationwide and in California, 165 Nearly 70% of young black men will be imprisoned at some point in their lives, and poor black men with low levels of education make up a disproportionate share of incarcerated Americans. 166 Mass incarcerations create a vicious cycle. Studies have shown that lower wealth increases the likelihood of incarceration, and incarceration decreases the ability to build or maintain wealth. 167 African Americans, who have lower family wealth than white Americans, 168 are especially vulnerable to incarceration. 169 Growing up with less family wealth means living in poorer neighborhoods with lower quality education and a greater exposure to high street crime and high imprisonment areas. 62% of African Americans live in highly segregated, inner-city neighborhoods where socioeconomic vulnerabilities contribute to higher rates of violent crime. 170 While the majority of white Americans live in highly advantaged neighborhoods where there is little violent crime. 171 Land ownership. Black farmers. In 1910, black farmers owned 16 million acres of land. In 2007, They own 3.2 million acres, an 80% loss. Mass incarceration creates a vicious cycle. Studies have shown that lower wealth increases the likelihood of incarceration and incarceration decreases the ability to build or maintain wealth.